Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week I alternate between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. This week's episode is an Unpacking Scholarship episode where I will talk about the paper titled Confronting the Challenges of Participatory Culture, Media Education for the 21st Century. This is a white paper, so it is available for free. Anybody can read it. And I include a link to it in the show notes. And this particular white paper was written by Henry Jenkins, Katie Clinton, Ravi Purushotma, Alice J. Robison, and Margaret Weigel. Apologies if I mispronounce anybody's names. All right, so you might be wondering, well, what exactly is participatory culture? So here's a quote from page 3. Quote, "A participatory culture is a culture with relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement, strong support for creating and sharing one's creations, and some type of an informal mentorship, whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. A participatory culture is also one in which members believe their contributions matter and feel some degree of social connection with one another. At the least, they care what other people think about what they have created." End quote. All right, so there are 4 main forms of participatory culture. These include affiliations, expressions, collaborative problem solving, and circulations. Okay, so affiliations are like the memberships or maybe even some like formal or informal group connections that you might have. So being a part of like CSTA or ISTE, those are affiliations. However, it could also be that you are affiliated with certain ways of making. So for example, if you consider yourself to be a maker, then that is an affiliation with maker culture. So it doesn't have to be like a formal, here's my membership card. Now, the expressions are the things that you create within those affiliations. So, for example, if you are a maker, then it would be the things that you make or the things that you share, whether it be a tutorial on how to create something or the actual product that you created. These are all forms of expressions. Now, you'll notice in the episode 2 weeks ago where I unpacked a paper by Resnick and Rusk, the expressions within that particular paper were the projects made in Scratch. So coding can be an expression. Okay, so the next form of participatory culture is collaborative problem solving. So in collaborative problem solving, you are working together with other people in some kind of a shared discussion that is attempting to solve some kind of a problem. Now, these teams can be formal or informal teams. So you could be working together with other CS educators to try and figure out how do I best design a learning experience that is around abstraction and accounts for multiple ways of learning and being. Posing a question like this to other members of like CSTA could then engage in some kind of formal problem solving, or it could be informal. Okay, and the last form of participatory culture is circulations. So this is the flow of media. So examples might include a retweet. This is circulating some ideas, or like this podcast is a form of circulation. If you are a blogger like Dan Schneider is, which listen to his interview, it's really good. Any of those forms of sharing the content or sharing the expressions with various affiliations, that is a form of circulation. All right, so Jenkins et al. Mentions there are some potential benefits of engaging in participatory cultures. So these include, quote, opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, a changed attitude toward intellectual property, the diversification of cultural expression, the development of skills valued in the modern workplace, and a more empowered concern of citizenship, end quote. That's from page 3. While there are some benefits, Jenkins et al. Mentions that there are some potential concerns that need to be addressed. So these concerns are 1, the participation gap, 2, the transparency problem, and 3, the ethics challenge. All right, so this paper is going to unpack each of those 3 particular challenges and also talk about the different forms of participatory culture a little bit more. So what's interesting to note, and this builds off of some of the ideas in the Unpacking Scholarship episode from 2 weeks ago, is that, quote, participatory culture shifts the focus of literacy from one of individual expression to community involvement. The new literacies almost all involve social skills developed through collaboration and networking. These skills build on the foundation of traditional literacy, research skills, technical skills, and critical analysis skills taught in the classroom, end quote. That's from page 4. So the various skills are outlined on page 4, and they include play, performance, simulation, appropriation, multitasking, distributed cognition, collective intelligence, judgment, transmedia navigation, networking, and negotiation. All right, so I'm going to unpack each of those individually a little bit later in this episode. So one of the interesting quotes that's in here is that there was a study that is cited, and this study was from 2005. It said that 57% of teens who use the internet could be considered media creators. Now, I imagine that that number is significantly higher with all the people who are engaging in platforms at the moment like TikTok, or who are sharing things on YouTube or streaming things on services like Twitch, etc. So 15 years ago, at least at the time of this recording, more than half of teens were considered to be some kind of a media creator. So the authors are arguing that this is a very important skill to discuss and to start learning within classes. However, the authors also point out that there are some equity issues in terms of who is able to create and who tends to create. So for example, there are differences in percentage of people who engage and create media, depending on if you're in an urban setting, if you're in a suburban setting, a rural setting, depending on your gender, etc. Now, this study also didn't account for different ways of making media, such as podcasting. It didn't also account for things like gaming or creating music, like in the hip-hop community, or sampling, etc. So even though the numbers are high, it didn't account for many things that the authors point out was relevant when this paper was written, and is even more relevant 15 years after this particular study, i.e. today. Okay, so that was kind of the intro of some of the main things that are going to be discussed in this particular paper. So now the authors dive into, well, what exactly is participatory culture? So participatory culture has 5 key characteristics, and they are, quote, 1, with relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement. 2, with strong support for creating and sharing one's creations with others. 3, with some type of informal mentorship whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. 4, where members believe that their contributions matter. 5, where members feel some degree of social connection with one another, at least they care what other people think about what they have created. End quote. From page 7. Here's an interesting quote that really contrasts what happens in school settings. This is also from page 7. Quote, not every member must contribute, but all must believe they are free to contribute when ready, and that what they contribute will be appropriately valued, end quote. So thinking back to some of the previous episodes, like the Pedagogy of the Press episodes, where I've talked about how school can be oppressive, and some of the other episodes where I have kind of talked about how the kids that I worked with could engage in classes in different levels in different ways, some being more active while others being more passive. This was heavily informed initially by this particular paper. So in a discussion that's going to come out down the road with Melissa Raspberry from American Institute for Research, we talk about how it's difficult to measure participation in online spaces and informal places, in particular because people engage with content and they don't necessarily share with others how they are engaging with that content. So as an example, if you read a really cool article on somebody's blog, you might go and implement that in their classroom. That person who wrote the blog might not have any idea that you did that unless you go back and actually share that with somebody else. So like responding to their blog with a comment. So with all that being said, I think it's important for us as educators to kind of consider what kinds of participation count, and when is it okay to kind of just sit back and give some time to think through some things. So one of the other things that I have mentioned in previous episodes that was heavily informed by this particular paper is that it's not as important what tools we are using, but how we are using it and to what ends. So here's a quote that kind of summarizes that. Quote, a focus on expanding access to new technologies carries us only so far if we do not also foster the skills and cultural knowledge necessary to deploy those skills toward our own ends, end quote. That's from page 8. So if we expand this quote and think of it in context of computer science as a whole, in my opinion, it is not okay to just do computer science for the sake of doing computer science, but finding ways to use these skills and concepts and practices that one gains through an engagement of computer science in a way that is individually meaningful for the person who is learning it. So in other words, making it so that kids have the opportunity to take what they are learning and applying it in a way that is interesting and relevant to them. This connects with the Unpacking Scholarship episode that I did on Gloria Ladson-Billings' seminal paper on culturally relevant pedagogy, but it also just connects with many of the discussions I've had with other guests and Unpacking Scholarship episodes on interest-driven learning and the importance of contextualizing learning, which Chris Woods talked about in a recent interview, I think released last week. So make sure you listen to that if you haven't. All right, so the next section of the paper talks about affinity spaces, which is a concept that is built off of Levin Wenger's community of practice, but it is in particular designed for more informal and online spaces. However, it can be applicable in a whole bunch of different scenarios. And this concept is developed mainly by James Paul G., who's a professor of mine and who I've talked about in several other episodes. Now, affinity spaces, according to G., provide opportunities for learning because, quote, they are sustained by common endeavors that bridge differences in age, class, race, gender, and educational level, and because people can participate in various ways according to their skills and interests. Because they depend on peer-to-peer teaching, with each participant constantly motivated to acquire new knowledge or refine their existing skills, and because they allow each participant to feel like an expert while tapping the expertise of others. For example, Black finds that beta reading, or editorial feedback, provided by online fan communities helps contributors grow as writers, mastering not only the basic building blocks of sentence construction and narrative structure, but also pushing them to be close readers of the works that inspire them. Participants in the beta reading process learn both by receiving feedback on their own work and by giving feedback to others, creating an ideal peer-to-peer learning community. End quote. It's from page 9. Okay, while a great example of reading and learning within online spaces, I want to now kind of apply this in computer science education. So in my own dissertation, one of the things that was really interesting is people were constantly sharing their source code with other people within this online discussion forum and asking for comments and ways to refine things, or even engaging in some kind of collaborative problem solving. Like, hey, I've got this bug, I can't figure out how to do this thing. Can somebody take a look at my code and help me solve this? So what could be argued is that people are learning not only by reading other people's code, but by also reading other people's comments about their own code, or by providing feedback to other people. So it's this interesting way of learning by sharing, or by learning by responding to people who are sharing. So one of the things that I tried to do in the classroom was find ways to do this. So encouraging kids to share their projects so that other classes, other grade levels could read their code and respond to it. This kind of feedback would help people learn by sharing their own creative expressions, and help people learn by going, oh, wow, that's a really cool example of a project. I wonder how I could change it to do X, Y, or Z. Or I wonder how I could take this code and apply it in my own projects. One of the interesting things that is also noted on page 9 is that people are able to come and go as they please through informal learning communities. So if an individual is in a community and they are not finding that their needs are met, they are not able to solve the problems that they're trying to solve, or they don't feel that they are able to get as much out of the collaborative process as they would like, then they can go to another affinity space or informal place, or even create their own. Now, this is very different than within formalized education. Within formalized education, you are required to be within certain spaces or places and classes and subject areas. And you don't have that luxury of being able to go, you know what, this isn't really working for me. I'm going to go find a new class, or I'm going to go find a new teacher, etc. All right, so the next section of the paper after the affinity spaces discussion talks about the 3 core problems or challenges related to participatory culture and on why we should teach media literacy to kids. So let's unpack the first one, the participation gap. So one that we are finding in this era of COVID is that there is a huge lack of access to devices or adequate internet speeds to even engage in online or remote teaching and learning. One of the good things that has come out of COVID is educators and districts understanding that what children have access to at home has a huge impact on their learning. So prior to this, one of the things that Jenkins et al. Mentions is that kids who have access to fast internet speeds and powerful computers at home have more opportunities to engage in these participatory literacies than students who do not. This can create a huge participation gap in terms of everybody getting equal amount of time within schools, ideally, to be able to create something, But then outside of schools, on weeknights and on weekends, the kids who have access to devices and internet are able to dive much deeper into something. So how this relates to computer science, I think about the kids in my school who had access to devices and internet at home, and so they would continue learning, whether it be continuing through the Khan Academy course, or continuing to work on their project in Scratch, or being able to make something in Xcode on their computer at home, etc. These were all ways that kids were able to continue their participation at home, outside of school, on their own time. But the kids who didn't have that kind of access were unable to continue their learning in the same ways that they could in school. Now, because these participation gaps are often not discussed in education, some kids might look at others and go, oh, well, I'm just not naturally good at this. Because when I'm in my class, in my computer science class, and I look at my peers' project, theirs is so much more interesting than mine. It has way more code, it's got way more sprites, it's a lot more fun, etc. But what they might not be realizing is that that kid might have the opportunity to go home and work on it. Like, I'd have some kids who would turn in like projects on like 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday because they just wanted to go home and work on it. I didn't ask them to, but they were able to. This can have a huge impact on the quality of the creative expressions that kids are able to do within computer science, just because they have more time and more ability to do this. And I mean, think about this in relation to other areas. So this idea builds off of what was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, but the 10,000 hour rule, which really isn't a rule, that was developed by K. Anders Ericsson, a sports psychologist. So the more time that you're able to dedicate towards something, whether it's a literacy, a skill, a sport, or whatever, as long as you're engaging in it in some kind of deliberate way and are intentionally striving to become better at it, a lot of research indicates that you are going to consistently outperform the people who put in less time into it. Hands down, across basically any subject area, cut that. Okay, so that was the participation gap. So here's the second challenge, the transparency problem. Okay, so the transparency problem, quote, assumes that children are actively reflecting on their media experiences and can thus articulate what they learn from their participation. So in other words, just because kids are engaging in technology and are engaging in some of these participatory ways of creating and sharing and circulating and learning, etc., does not mean they're actually critically reflecting on their processes and engagement and thinking through potential legal ramifications or social ramifications, etc. So for example, taking the works of others and not giving credit where it's just due, or responding in ways that are considered to be bullying or hurtful or abusive, or creating a program that allows them to do distributed denial of service attacks, so DDoSes, on a network, like what happens to a lot of gaming networks. So these are all ways of engaging in media or socially through technology that might not include critical reflections, which can cause some harm. Which gets into the third challenge, which is the ethics challenge. So kids might not be aware of the ethical ways of engaging in media or in computer science. So we as educators need to help assist them with finding the ethical ways of doing things. So as an example, some kids are really interested in hacking and want to learn how to do that, but there are ethical ways of hacking that can actually help companies by finding flaws and reporting those flaws as opposed to exploiting those flaws. All right, so on page 18, the authors kind of summarize 3 core questions that kind of guide a potential response to these challenges. Quote, how do we ensure that every child has access to the skills and experiences needed to become a full participant in the social, cultural, economic, and political future of our society? How do we ensure that every child has the ability to articulate his or her understanding of how media shapes perceptions of the world? How do we ensure that every child has been socialized into the emerging ethical standards that should shape their practices, as media makers, and as participants in online communities, end quote. All right, so the rest of the paper kind of provides a framework for addressing these 3 questions around those 3 problems or challenges. Okay, so the next section is titled, What Should We Teach? Rethinking Literacy. In this particular section, they're talking about how what they are arguing for is not a removal of the old forms of engaging with literacy, so for example, reading and writing text, but engaging in the new social skill of media literacies that expand upon and complement the old forms of engaging with literacy. Tying this to computer science, if we think of coding as a literacy, they're not saying that we should get rid of everything else and only focus on coding, but instead incorporate coding into other forms of literacy. So for example, Scratch is really good at combining media literacy, the ability to create stories and games and animations, with coding literacy, because you have to use algorithms to create the stories, games, etc. As another example, instead of doing a book report on something, you could encourage kids to engage in coding practices that allow them to synthesize and summarize their understandings of the book through a coding project. So this combines the old form of literacy of writing a synthesis or summary of something that you read by applying it into a project that involves code and other forms of media. Now, one of the interesting quotes from page 20 is that, quote, "The new media literacies should be seen as social skills as ways of interacting within a larger community, and not simply an individualized skill to be used for personal expression," end quote. So this relates to the paper that I unpacked 2 weeks ago by Resnick and Rusk. It resonates because those authors also mentioned the ability to engage in creative expression through a platform such as Scratch. However, it also emphasized the importance of engaging in a community and participating in it in ways that allow people to share and learn from each other. So as computer science educators, one of the things that we can take into account are two frameworks for learning. So one is constructionism, which is the idea that you can create and learn through the creation of a product, but constructivism, which is the idea that you learn through social interactions. So if you combine those two approaches and encourage kids to create something in some kind of a programming language, but also share their understandings and learn from their peers in some kind of a collaborative and communicative process, this can make it so that kids are learning not only through the creation of an expression, but through the discussions around that creative process. So in other words, encourage peer-to-peer learning, encourage sharing of understanding, encourage kids to share their project with somebody else, get some feedback, revise what they're doing, and keep iterating on their abilities and their understandings in computer science education. Now, I will say this is very different than many other classes and approaches. So when administrators would come into my room, they would frequently comment on the noise that was in the room because, one, there was music playing through the speakers, because I always had EDM going. But two, there was also just so much dialogue with kids getting up and walking around and talking to each other and sharing. And it was mostly on-task dialogue. Like the administrators were like, wow, they're really engaged in coding and they're really engaged in talking about this in this class. And then this was different when they walk into that same class in a math setting where everyone was sitting and silently working on a worksheet or something. There was no dialogue, there was no peer-to-peer sharing and learning. So it's something that can be valued and can be used in a computer science context. Now, on page 21, one of the things that the authors mentions is it doesn't need to just occur within the classes that you're working on. It doesn't have to be within even the school that you're working on. There are ways to make it so that kids can collaborate long distance, whether it's synchronously or asynchronously. So some educators that I know, they have, back when classes were meeting in person, they would set up a computer that was virtually connected to another class that met at the same time. And kids could go up and ask each other questions like, hey, what are you working on? Hey, what are you learning? How did you do this? How did you do that? Other educators, like especially in the high school settings, will also encourage engaging in discussion forums or going to resources like Stack Overflow and trying to find potential answers to questions that they might have. And obviously critically reflecting on those answers to see if they fit within what they're trying to do. But these are all ways of engaging in long-distance learning or collaborating with people outside of the school. So what I would encourage you to do is try and figure out ways to do that. One way might be to create studios in platforms like Scratch. Another might be through a class website or even a shared website where multiple schools across the district or across states or countries might be able to share understandings with each other. Another way might be to create a discussion forum or a wiki that kids can use and is not publicly available, but is only accessible to a group of teachers that you are collaborating with and their classes that they work with, etc. All right, so next up in the paper is a discussion on the core media literacy skills that I very briefly mentioned at the start of this podcast. So the first one that they talk about is play, which again really resonates with Resnick and Rusk's article from 2 weeks ago. Okay, so here's how the authors define play. Quote, the capacity to experiment with one's surroundings as a form of problem solving, end quote, from page 22. And here's another quote that kind of elaborates on this. Quote, play, as psychologists and anthropologists have long recognized, is key in shaping children's relations to their bodies, tools, communities, surroundings, and knowledge. Most of children's earliest learning comes through playing with the materials at hand. Through play, children try on roles, experiment with culturally central processes, manipulate core resources, and explore their immediate environments. As they grow older, play can motivate other forms of learning, end quote, from page 22. Now, the authors note that while play is generally viewed as fun, there are many times when the process is a grind. So as an example, if you're creating a game that involves some kind of physics, it might be difficult to code the object detection or to code the right amount of friction or gravity or etc. in a game. This is a tedious and laborious process that isn't necessarily viewed as fun, but is engaged in a very fierce and passionate way because kids want to learn how to do it to create their game. And the reason why they want to invest the time into it, that the authors would argue, and that I would argue, is because they're motivated to do it. If, however, you were to give a worksheet on friction or on gravity or whatever in like a physics class, kids might not be interested in it. But if you suddenly situate that knowledge and that understanding within a problem for creating a game, suddenly there's a lot of interest in it. And by engaging in play, and in particular in some computational thinking practices like debugging and whatnot, it makes it so that failure is not a huge problem. It's, oh, I have this bug that I needed to solve, and I'm going to solve it in order to fix my game. This is something that the authors really argue is a good thing, and that is, thankfully, something that is a huge part of computer science education. It's one of those standards where even when you don't want to, you're going to engage in some debugging. So towards the end of this, on page 24, the authors have the following quote. Play in the context argued here is a mode of active engagement, one that encourages experimentation and risk-taking, one that views the process of solving a problem as important as finding the answer, one that offers clearly defined goals and roles that encourage strong identifications and emotional investments, end quote, from page 24. Now, by the way, after each one of these discussions on the core media literacy skills, there is a section that says what might be done. And within that, there are several paragraphs of how this particular core media literacy skill might be applied in a different subject area. Rather than summarizing and reading through each one of those, I'm going to kind of embed some of the ideas relevant to computer science education into the discussion of each of these. However, because this paper is free, I highly recommend that you actually go through and read through these to get some more ideas. This is just a very quick overview of a paper that is like 70 pages long. All right, so the next core media literacy skill is simulation. So here's a quote from page 25 that describes what simulation is. Quote, the ability to interpret and construct dynamic models of real-world processes, end quote. This obviously highly relates to computer science education, as there are standards that are related to this. Now, the authors note that in this discussion, kids learn a lot by engaging in simulations through video games. And there are a lot of authors who discuss that. So, for example, check out works by James Paul G, or Kurt Squire, or Sasha Barab, or Constance Steinkuehler, etc. I'll link to their Google Scholar profiles in the show notes. So if you're interested in learning more about this, you'll be able to dive deeper into some of their publications. Now, one of the things that I'd add is that instead of just engaging in simulations, if from a computer science context, we can actually encourage kids to create these simulations. So while it is an awesome core media literacy skill to engage in and learn from simulations, it might be even more interesting to create them. All right, so the next core media literacy skill is performance. So here's a quote from page 28 on what it is. Quote, "The ability to adopt alternative identities for the purpose of improvisation and discovery," end quote. So the authors note that kids can learn a lot by taking on different identities. And so one way that we can actually situate this within like some of the Common Core standards related to ELA is taking on either fictional or nonfiction identities and thinking through different scenarios or problems through different perspectives. So one of the computer science standards is seeking diverse perspectives for some kind of a product that you're creating. So whether it be software or hardware or whatever, you get perspectives from different people, from different cultures, different abilities or disabilities, from different genders, etc. Like they all can provide different forms of feedback. All right, so the next one, appropriation. So this quote is from page 32. Quote, "The ability to meaningfully sample and remix media content," end quote. Now, appropriation has kind of been given a bad label lately, in that a lot of well-intentioned individuals label many things as cultural appropriation and are saying that it's problematic. However, there is a difference between cultural appropriation, or just appropriation, and misappropriation. So there are many ways to engage and appropriate content in a way that is meaningful and relevant and appropriate and still maintains respect for the person who created the object. And then there are ways to do it in problematic ways. So I'm not going to get into a rant on my thoughts about the misuse of cultural appropriation and misappropriation, but just know that the way that Jenkins and the other authors are describing this are not how most people describe appropriation nowadays. So as an example of the ways that they kind of talk about it, think of a Scratch project in particular. It's really easy to click the remix button. Clicking the remix button and making your own variation of that is an appropriation. And it is something that is encouraged within communities like Scratch or platforms like Scratch. Another way of appropriating is by going to something like Stack Overflow, taking somebody else's code and modifying it to do something for your particular program. That is another form of appropriation. You are essentially remixing somebody else's code. If we think about this outside of computer science, one of the easy ways that you can think of appropriation is in music. So I did a paper in my master's on appropriation that was involved in rap and how the many sampling techniques and remixing techniques take little snippets of sounds or beats or melodies or whatever and applies it in some kind of a new context and combines it with other artists. So it's a way of basically paying homage to musicians who have came before the artists and taking some of their ideas and remixing them in a new way or appropriating them in a new way. Another example of this outside of music or computer science is fan fiction. So fan fiction is basically when people take some kind of a work of fiction and they create side stories or side paths related to it. So they build off of it. So for example, in Harry Potter, there's fan fiction around that where people will take the characters within the world of Harry Potter and will make their own side stories for like Ron or for Harry or for whoever that they really like. This is a form of appropriation that the authors are talking about. Now, tying this back again into computer science, we can use appropriation in the classroom. So for example, if kids are really into a particular anime or a particular video game or work of fiction, we can essentially engage in our own version of fan fiction through like storytelling in platforms like Scratch or creating a game based off of a game, etc. These are all forms of appropriation that we can engage in computer science classes. Okay, so the next core media literacy skill is multitasking. So here's a quote from page 34 that talks about what that is. Quote, "The ability to scan one's environment and shift focus onto salient details on an ad hoc basis," end quote. So here's a quote from page 35 that talks about this a little bit more. Quote, "Instead of focusing on narrowing attention, young people often respond to a rich media environment by multitasking, scanning for relevant shifts in the information flow while simultaneously taking in multiple stimuli. Multitasking and attention should not be seen as oppositional forces. Rather, we should think of them as two complementary skills, both strategically employed by the brain to intelligently manage constraints on short-term memory. Whereas attention seeks to prevent information overload by controlling what information enters short-term memory, successful multitaskers seek to reduce demands on short-term memory by mapping where different information is externally stored within their immediate environment, end quote. So in other words, multitasking is being able to look at a wide range of information and to be able to kind of draw out the important information that is relevant at the given moment. In particular, it is being able to respond to that overwhelming amount of information. So in computer science education, multitasking might be encouraging people to find answers by going out to search for it on the web and being able to sift through a bunch of information and find what is relevant and responding to that by applying it into their problem. All right, so the next core media literacy skill is distributed cognition. This one in particular has really had a profound impact on me. So here's a quote on page 37 that talks about what it is. Quote, "The ability to interact meaningfully with tools that expand our mental capacities," end quote. So as an easy example of distributed cognition, think of the contacts on your phone. So on your phone, you likely have the ability to save a person's full name, a person's address, a person's phone number, maybe their email address, maybe their social media handles, etc. And you can do that for hundreds, if not thousands of people on your phone. The way that this is distributed cognition is it allows you to not have to store that information into your own brain, but instead you are offloading that information onto your phone so that way you can focus on other things. Another very simple example is that a calculator is a form of distributed cognition. Although you could sit there and by hand, do all sorts of large equations and problems, a calculator allows you to solve more complex math problems much more faster by simply inputting in the equation or formula. So you can focus on the answer as it relates to the problem you are trying to solve, rather than having to focus on the individual details of solving the math equation. The authors point out that distributed cognition can also relate to social productions of knowledge, which ties into the very next media literacy skill, which is collective intelligence. Okay, so collective intelligence. Here's a quote from page 39. Quote, "The ability to pool knowledge and compare notes with others towards a common goal," end quote. Okay, so one really easy example of collective intelligence is a wiki. So a wiki on any particular topic is basically an article about something that is collaboratively written and revised by hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So rather than having to rely on one source of information to explain something or elaborate on something, collective intelligence is tapping into many people and their expertise or intelligences on a particular subject. All right, so how distributed cognition and collective intelligence might work within a class. So think of all the kids in your classes and think about how they all have different types of expertise in relation to computer science. So some kids that I knew were really good at creating player controls, other kids I knew were really good at creating physics, while some were really good at conditionals, etc. What I would do in my classes is whenever a kid would have a problem and they'd ask their friends for help and a couple of their friends couldn't help, they would typically come to me and say, "Hey, I'm having trouble with X." What I would typically respond with is, "Oh, Susie is awesome at helping people with X. How about you go ask Susie and they'll be able to help you?" So this is a form of distributed cognition where you're distributing forms of expertise across groups of people. So it doesn't have to just be with tools. Now, how this relates to collective intelligence is the class as a whole was able to work together to kind of solve some kind of problem, whether it be a project that they are working on in groups or just computer science as a whole. Now, what would be really neat and ideal is engaging in distributed cognition and collective intelligence outside of just the class that you're working with. So connecting kids with others within the school, outside of the district, etc. Now, the authors point out that this approach is very different than what typically goes on in schools. So here's a quote from page 42. Quote, "Schools, on the other hand, often seek to develop generalists rather than allowing students to assume different roles based on their emerging expertise. The idea of the Renaissance man was someone who knew everything or at least knew a great deal about a range of different topics. The idea of a collective intelligence is a community that knows everything and individuals who know how to tap the community to acquire knowledge on a just-in-time basis. Minimally, schools should be teaching students to thrive in both worlds, having a broad background on a range of topics, but also knowing when they should turn to a larger community for relevant expertise. End quote. That is such an important quote, and it really resonates with my own approach to all the classes that I worked with, whether it was K-12 or higher education. Highly recommend finding a way to apply these different core media literacy skills in the class. And again, read the actual paper to get even more ideas. This podcast is a very short, well, relatively short summary of what you'll find in the paper itself. All right, so the next core media literacy skill is judgment, which is, quote, the ability to evaluate the reliability and credibility of different information sources, end quote, from page 43. All right, this has been discussed a lot since this particular paper came out 15 years ago in 2005. So think about all the claims for fake news, etc., and alternative facts or whatever that's going on in political and social environments right now. But tying it into computer science education, kids need to be able to verify, is this a reliable source of information? So when you're searching for something online, you're trying to find some kind of a solution to a bug or a problem or whatever, kids need to be able to identify, is this reliable source of information? Should I trust this? So it's not only important information just in social context, but it's also important to be able to engage with this in computer science context. Okay, so the next core media literacy skill is transmedia navigation. So this is, quote, the ability to deal with the flow of stories and information across multiple modalities, end quote, from page 46. So an example of this is learning about a particular subject area. So if you were a computer science teacher who is brand new to learning a particular programming language, you might engage in transmedia navigation by trying to learn more about a particular topic. So for example, if you're trying to figure out how a language deals with different versions of conditionals, you could read a blog post, you could watch a YouTube video, you could listen to a podcast, you could look at somebody's code, etc. These are all forms of media that you can engage with, and as you're navigating across these different types of media, whether it's a video or audio or text-based or whatever, these are all forms of media that you are navigating through, and so that's why it's called transmedia navigation. So tying this into the classroom, one of the things that I would recommend is with kids in your class, encouraging them to try and find a variety of different sources and platforms for learning more about a particular topic. So rather than always going to Stack Overflow or always going to a particular YouTuber who answers coding questions or whatever, encourage getting a variety of perspectives and a variety of media sources to assist with understanding. All right, so the next core media literacy skill is networking. So this is, quote, the ability to search for, synthesize, and disseminate information, end quote, from page 49. So here's a good quote from page 50 that distinguishes transmedia navigation with networking. Quote, if transmedia navigation involves learning to understand the relations between different media systems, networking involves the ability to navigate across different social communities, end quote. So one way you might think of networking is engaging with different types of social communities in terms of maybe you'll encourage kids to communicate with other kids for an answer, or maybe across different grade levels, or maybe they might ask different teachers for help, or maybe they might ask professional programmers for help, or a professor, etc. These are all different types of social communities that might be considered within the networking skill. And depending on the kinds of firewalls and things that are in place with your district, you may or may not be able to engage in some kinds of networking versus others, depending on the grade levels you are working with. But again, going back to what I said previously, this encourages a multi-perspectival approach in terms of you're not just engaging with different media sources, but you're also engaging with different perspectives from different communities or different types of people that you are seeking expertise from. So one thing that we could do is potentially encourage social media within our class. But again, that's really kind of up to administrative policies and whatnot and what you're able to get away with in your classes. All right, so the very last core media literacy skill is negotiation. Here's a quote from page 52 that describes negotiation. Quote, the ability to travel across diverse communities, discerning and respecting multiple perspectives, and grasping and following alternative sets of norms, end quote. Here's a quote from page 53. Quote, "It becomes increasingly critical to help students acquire skills in understanding multiple perspectives, respecting and even embracing diversity of views, understanding a variety of social norms, and negotiating between conflicting opinions," end quote. So while engaging in all these different platforms and different social groups, it is important for students to understand that each platform or social group has different norms in terms of the expectations for how you're supposed to engage. So the authors argue that we need to be able to negotiate in order to fit within these norms or expectations. While I would argue that this approach that they're calling negotiation is useful for participatory culture, it's also just useful for general social engagement. I wish more people were willing to listen to and respect multiple perspectives. That would be wonderful right now. But it's 2020. Now, if you want to explore this topic some more, check out the interview with Brian Brown. It is a fantastic discussion on discourse and language as it relates to education. All right, so the next section of the paper is titled "Who Should Respond? A Systematic Approach to Media Education." So in this section, it provides suggestions for how schools, after school, and parents might respond to new media literacy education. While this section is useful, I'm not going to summarize it here because much of what is discussed I've kind of already talked about in the earlier parts of this episode. All right, so the paper concludes with a one-page discussion on the challenge ahead, ensuring that all benefit from the expanding media landscape. There is a quote from page 61 that kind of ends this paper. Quote, "How can we ensure that all students benefit from learning in ways that allow them to participate fully in public, community, creative, and economic life? How do we guarantee that the rich opportunities afforded by the expanding media landscape are available to all? What can we do through schools, after-school programs, and the home to give our youngest children a head start and allow our more mature youth the chance to develop and grow as effective participants and ethical communicators? This is a challenge that faces education at all levels at the dawn of a new era of participatory culture," end quote, from page 61. So if we take that sentiment and apply it to computer science education, this strongly relates to what I was talking about 2 weeks ago with the discussion on Resnick and Rusk's recent article on coding at the crossroads. So if we think that computer science or coding is something that people should engage in within schools, in after-school programs, at home, etc., how can we do it in a way that helps them become more effective participants within computer science education and computer science community, and become ethical communicators and creators? So as always, I like to kind of end these Unpacking Scholarship episodes with a discussion on some of my lingering thoughts or questions. So when I initially read this paper, it was in 2012, so about 8 years ago. And my main lingering question was, okay, how could I do this in a classroom? So when I went back into the classroom, after I finished my coursework, I was intentionally trying to find ways to test these approaches or skills and attempt to apply them into the classroom. Whether it was in the K-12 setting, like in the elementary and middle school coding programs I worked with, the high school drumline, or in the undergrad and graduate courses that I was facilitating at universities. In each one of these contexts, I was trying to apply the different core media literacy skills that I have briefly mentioned in this podcast. And so what I'm going to recommend for any educator is to actually go through and read through the paper itself, get some ideas, and try and apply them into the classes that you work with in some way. Hopefully this podcast has helped with that, but what I will say is that having attempted these in the class, it can work, and it can work really well. Kids really enjoyed my class, generally speaking. I really enjoyed my classes. They were a lot of fun to facilitate. There was so much excitement with kids being able to create things that were interesting to them and engage in media and computer science and coding in relevant and interesting ways. And it was heavily informed by this particular paper. So I've talked about the different successes and the things that have worked well in other interviews and Unpacking Scholarship episodes. I'm going to just kind of leave with the question of how might you apply these core media literacy skills in your class? Whether you are a full-time computer science educator, or you are an educator who is integrating computer science, or you are a person who is interested in computer science but haven't really tried anything yet. There are many interesting things that you can apply from this paper in your classroom, whether that's a formalized classroom or an informal classroom. I hope this podcast was a good teaser to encourage you to want to read the actual paper. Again, you can find it by going to the show notes, which are linked to in the description of the app that you're listening to this on, or by simply going to jaredoleary.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with somebody else, and stay tuned next week for another interview, and 2 weeks from now for another Unpacking Scholarship episode. I hope you're all having a wonderful week and are staying safe.